All right, everyone, just gonna give a couple minutes for everyone to join us. And if you are joining, just want to say welcome. Just to familiarize yourself, there is a chat option. So if you do have questions through, through the presentation, feel free to use the chat function. You should see it on your screen where you can chat. That will type a message to me and I'll be able to see it. So I'll do my best to pay attention to those messages while we're in the midst of the presentation. But if there's any that I miss, I'll go back through at the end and try to answer those. I have also put my email address and my phone number at the end of the presentation, so feel free to write that down. And if you do have a question that you think of later or just didn't get to, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to answer your question that way. Okay. And I'm just going to turn my video off, just give a couple more minutes for people to continue joining. All right, well, for the sake of time, let's go ahead and get started. My name's Cory. I'm the Museum Curator at the Works in Newark. And today we're going to be talking about Tales of Old Newark. So I wanted to talk about Newark in the first couple decades of its existence. It's easy to talk about late 19th century Newark, even Newark post 1870s and onward, because we still have a lot of things around from that time. But earlier Newark is a little bit more, elusive, because there aren't as many things existing now from that point in time, and it's changed quite a bit. So throughout the presentation, I am going to be turning off my camera momentarily. It's kind of dark in my dining room where I am right now, and just for the sake of seeing what's on the screen, I will be turning my camera off so that you guys don't have to look at me the whole time. However, as I said, please familiarize yourself with the screen. If you're familiar with Zoom, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions. I do have it pulled up so that I'll be able to see any questions that you have. So throughout the presentation, if you think of something, please feel free to type me a message and I will try to address it if I see it. If not, I'll go back through at the end and try to take care of all of the questions then. Also, my contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so please reach out to me if you think of something later, or if you have any sort of comments or anything like that, and I will get back with you on that. So let me go ahead and turn myself off so you're not just staring at my face. Can everybody see? You should see a slide that says Tales of Old Newark. If you don't and you can hear me, then I guess type a message, but if not, then we should be good. All right. So this is the thing that really created Newark. This is kind of nicknamed Newark's birth certificate. And if you can see at the top, it says Franklin, 20th of November, 1801. Now, Franklin is a community that I believe is in Morrow County, and it was relatively young at the time. And it had been laid out and founded by William Courtness Schenck. If you're familiar with Newark's history, that name might sound familiar to you because William Schenck was the person who laid out Newark as well. He was a surveyor and had been a member of the legislature and involved through government in a variety of different ways. He had actually been born in New Jersey, but he lived all over what was then the Northwest Territory when he originally came. And as I said, he had laid out a town in Western Ohio called Franklin in the 1790s. So that's where he was living, actually. He wasn't really a pioneer to this area. He was just a surveyor, essentially. So he had helped to survey and lay out the city of Newark. So this letter was written in 1801, and it essentially laid out the terms of what would become the city. It even went so far as to specify what types of buildings could be used. It's a little bit difficult to read some of the handwriting, but if you look through, looks like the second or third paragraph says, I've given away 10 in and 10 out lots. So he's mentioning the types of lots that there were. And he even said how big the homes should be. He, a little bit further down, wanted there to be brick, stone, frame, or hewn log houses, not less than 22 by 18 feet with a brick or stone chimney and shingled roof. He did not want any log houses to have messy corners. So he wanted them to be flush, butted flush, or it says handsomely sawed. No clapboard roofs. So he put some stipulations on things there. On the right is a drawing essentially of the original layout of Newark. That was not drawn by William Schenck. That's copied from the original plat that was recorded in Lancaster. Now, if you're wondering why it was recorded in Lancaster, at the time that Ohio, or that Newark was founded, which was officially in 1802, that letter that we just saw was written in 1801. But in 1802, before Ohio was even a state, we were part of Fairfield County. So as you can see from this map, obviously there were far fewer counties in what became Ohio than there are now. And if you look over, I guess it's Warren County, sorry, where Franklin is, that other town that William Schenck had founded near Dayton. But as you can see, we were part of Fairfield County. So at the time that Newark was founded, the county seat was Lancaster. So that's where they went to register the survey of the city. You can see in this slide, it's basically laid out in a square. This is a fairly standard layout, one that's still pretty familiar to us now. The street names are obviously different. What's now Church Street is labeled North Street on this map. South Street is essentially the route of the canal, so Canal Street and Market Street. But first, second, third, fourth are all the same. East Main and West Main, of course, you can see the river along the edge. So this was the plan, the original plan of how Newark was laid out. And if we look at this, you can see, obviously it's based around the square. We start to see some things that are a little bit familiar to us in the layout, obviously courthouse in the middle. But what this is a drawn map that's based off of a firsthand account of early Newark. You can see in the bottom left, it says a sketch of Newark, Ohio, about 1808. It was drawn by H.F. Sicard in 1941. So he based this map off of a book that was called A Pen Picture of Newark and Vicinity as it appeared in 1818. And it was written somewhat anonymously. The author was just listed as a native of the city. However, we later found out that the person who wrote it was a man called Wellington Stanbury. And we'll talk about him and his family a little bit later, because the Stanburys were a prominent family. His father was William Stanbury and was locally very well known, as well as nationally. He was a member of Congress. So they were a well-known family, but they came to Newark very early. I believe 1809 was when the family actually moved to Newark, and William Schenck started practicing law here. So the book that this map was based off of is, based on firsthand accounts of Newark. And we're pretty fortunate because there are a few firsthand accounts that exist of Newark in that time. And it's incredibly rare to have those in a community in this area, because it was very much complete wilderness and pretty just rough and tumble kind of frontier at the time. So the fact that we have those firsthand accounts to even be able to know what was going on and what buildings were where is really great. So if you look at some of the things on this, there's some things that we recognize, of course. Courthouse is still in the middle, but there's a lot of things that are different. So if you notice, you'll see Lake Davidson, Lake Galt, Houston Lake, Lake Cully, Lake Kennedy. We don't obviously have lakes or ponds anywhere downtown. Originally, the landscape was a little bit different than it is now. It's been filled in and flattened out and generally changed so that it's appropriate for buildings and things that we have down there now. But originally it was kind of marshy. There were lots of little ponds everywhere. They sort of described the entire square as a frog pond. So it gives you an indication that it was pretty wet probably everywhere. And it was just sort of swampy and marshy. It doesn't really seem, in my opinion, to be the first place that you would choose to put a city or any sort of village. But I believe that they actually chose this location because of the confluence of the North Fork and the South Fork of the Licking River. So there was plenty of water nearby, water power for milling, and that was really important to be near to water. Some of the things that you'll notice, though, so we have a log courthouse in the middle. Directly west of the courthouse, there's actually a Presbyterian church. That was located originally on what's still part of the courthouse square. So rather than being across 3rd Street from the courthouse where buildings are now, that was actually on the square. Later, when they built another courthouse, they made a rule that no other buildings could sit on that square, on the common, essentially around the courthouse. But before that, there were a few other buildings there. I want to draw your attention, if you can look just, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but if you can see right here, Benjamin Briggs Printing Office. That was located actually on what they called Lake Sherwood, and it was kind of sitting up on stilts. Now, there are some inconsistencies between this map and the actual account that it was based off of. On this, it says about 1808. But Benjamin Briggs didn't actually come to Newark until 1820. Some of these names there, this map places them all together at the same point in time, but they didn't actually exist all together at the same point in time. So this is kind of condensing about 2 decades of Newark into one map, just for a note. And then there are a couple of things that the person who drew this map misinterpreted. So For instance, if you look up here, it says Common Well. That was actually over here, according to the description that the map is based off of. So it was east of the square rather than being on the square. But otherwise, this gives us a really great opportunity to picture how Newark was at the time. Really early on, the very first building, it's said to have been the first building ever to have been built in Newark in 1802, was called Black's Tavern. And it was actually on this corner where on this map it says Houston House, sign of the Crossed Keys. And it was a log cabin tavern. And that portion of the land was said to be a little bit higher than the surrounding area, and it was drier. So it was sort of a logical place to put something. Later on, in years much later, the Hotel Warden was located there. So they would claim that that had been the site of a hotel continuously since 1802, which is a little bit misleading. I found an article in 1959 when the Warden Hotel closed saying that the business had been there, or the Warden Hotel had been there since 1802, which was entirely false and very misleading. And they were, of course, trying to connect themselves to the heritage of having come about in the very beginning of Newark. However, there was a tavern there, and taverns did serve as inns where people would stay. So it definitely was there. By the point that the author, Wellington Stanberry, had written his account, which is a few years later, it had become the Houston House. But there were several taverns around. There were 4 in the downtown area, several stores. It mentions the homes of prominent people. And so it's a very interesting account. Now, this picture is not from that time period. This is later in the 19th century, but I wanted to show it because it shows something that people have a hard time believing about downtown Newark, and that's the geography. So as you can see, this is located actually on 4th Street. The house with the columns in the front is on the corner of 4th Street and West Church. Now it's in the vicinity of the tattoo shop downtown. But you can see it sits up on a hill, and comparing the people that are all along, now of course some of those are children, but there are men as well. You can see how tall that hill is. And downtown was full of these hills. A lot of them had retaining walls because the streets had been dug down, but it was not flat whatsoever in downtown. And so that kind of gives you a picture of how something on the square could have been on a hill. Also, Wellington Stanberry describes some of the roads, and speaking specifically about East Main Street, he mentioned that rather than being one 2-lane road, it was 2 individual lanes, so 2 individual roads going in opposite directions. But one side of the road was 10 to 15 feet higher than the other. So it was sort of on a ridge. It was also that way along the river, which the river banks are still slightly on different levels, but I think it was much more apparent at the time. So again, this picture is from around the turn of the century, late probably the 1890s. But I just wanted to show it to give you a better idea, to actually show proof that yes, downtown was quite different, even in terms of the landscape. Going back to this map though, I want you to notice some things. And can everybody see? So if I move my cursor, can someone let me know through the chat? Can you see my cursor? Because I think I can pull up something else if you can't. But you should be able to see it. Awesome. All right, thanks. So you can see right here, first public school. School was kept in several different buildings. It wasn't, there wasn't really a dedicated school, but this is the corner of, so this is 4th Street right here. This is the corner of 4th Street and East Main Street, or West Main Street, excuse me. This is Main Street, where the first public school was. But like I said, they were held in people's cabins. They would have schools in churches, that kind of thing. You'll notice there are several houses around, including right on the square. A lot of those houses were there and were then replaced by buildings. Some of the buildings, a couple that are still there on the square, replaced houses. But actually some of the buildings that we have downtown are the second round of downtown buildings that have been built. So that's why it makes it a little bit more difficult to talk about early Newark history, because we don't have many things surviving from that time period. A lot of the urban landscape that we see is a product of the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and onward. So some of those older buildings, while we do have some that still are around, they're not as apparent. This is another account of early Newark. This is a little bit later. This is a letter from 1834. And unfortunately, I don't know who this was written by because it's not signed by a name. But we do know that it was written from a woman to her seemingly younger brother, whose name was John Eaton. But again, I don't know who the lady was that actually wrote this, but she was writing this letter to her brother. She had come here to Newark, I would have to assume probably with her husband. And she came from somewhere in the East. I don't know whether she references Massachusetts in her letter, but I don't know if that's where she lived or not. Well, unfortunately, we don't know anything about her because we don't know who this was. But she gives a really, really interesting description of Newark, and she wrote a map for him. And so I do want to read you this letter because it's interesting and it's difficult to read. So I will read it for you. It's dated Newark, March 1834. So we're about 15 to 20 years later than what we were looking at earlier. So she says, beloved brother John, let me assure you that a little paper bearing the dear name of John S. Eaton was very gladly received. Also, the kisses through the medium of Emily's letter, though far sweeter would it be could I feel your sweet lips. When do you think I shall have this pleasure? Shall I ever welcome you in Newark? I often think of you, particularly when I have little warm cakes, such as you love, and almost wish you were near enough to partake them. Indeed, John, if you were here, you could have cakes and eggs in abundance. Eggs can now be purchased for 4 cents a dozen, and flour is cheap. And as there are 2 breweries, we can always have good yeast. These, with a good baker and good hard wood, which by the way is only 75 cents or so a cord, makes cakes plenty. You would also find some things are new to you. I never conceived of the immense numbers of wild pigeons that are daily seen. One place they have come in such multitudes as literally to break down the forest. This seems almost incredible, but I believe it is true. Mrs. Harris, with whom we live, tells of a case which she well recollects, and which you will think beats this. She says, they came one time in such crowds as to make a noise resembling thunder, and for 2 or 3 days it was dark, as if there was no sun, and they were so thick they could not fly, so that they could easily be taken with the hand. Now, just to break from this letter for a minute, this is really interesting to me because as historians, sometimes we study things that aren't seemingly obvious. And one of the things that I remember learning a lot about in college was the Carolina parakeet. They were famous for swarming, and they would literally kill trees because so many of them would roost in something. And so I don't know whether that's what these were. She calls them wild pigeons. The Carolina parakeet is since extinct, but it's an interesting crossover to think of some of the native wildlife that was here that's no longer around. And it's one way that this area has really changed. To go back to the letter, though, she continues, the little boys are very busily employed and of school in collecting minerals, which they present us, accompanied with expressions of great pleasure. Some of these are very curious, being petrified buffalo's horns, butterflies, honeycomb, clams, and sticks. I should like to send some of them to Massachusetts. Mr. H has promised a silver medal to the scholar who shall miss the least number of words and spelling during 12 weeks. 2 little boys about your age seem determined to win the prize. They're very ambitious, and on no account will they be absent one recitation. I want to hear how you get along with your studies, writing and composition, and if you're not able to fill me a sheet, you recollect how much you had to tell me when I had been away only a few weeks. Now I have been absent so many months, I think if I should see you, you would have a great deal more to tell me. Now that you would say I want you to write, let me know if you still talk of coming to live with me. I do really think, John, you would like Newark very well, and that you may have some idea of it. I will try to draw a small plan of it. So then she goes on to draw a map, which I zoomed in on here. There's a couple of buildings that she added. And then she numbered things. So it's difficult on the side to see because it's very faded. Most likely this was written in butternut ink or possibly walnut ink, but butternut ink was a very common ink that they would use, and it has this brownish tint. But the problem is that it's not light fast. So it only lasts for around 100 years, sometimes more, but it will start to fade naturally. And that's what looks like is starting to happen on this. So it's a little bit difficult to read at this point. But you can see she draws the square. There's the canal. She has listed the street names, which I think are interesting because a lot of the alleys she labeled. So you can see things like Plum Alley, Fountain Alley, Peach Alley. We don't really refer to alleys by name at all. So I think that's a very interesting thing. The courthouse in the center is obviously not the log courthouse that you saw on the last map, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And she did label a couple of other buildings. And then at the top up here, this right here is actually where she lived. So she mentioned that on the map. So she wrote under the map a little bit more. She says, this place is surrounded by water. On the east is a stream called North Fork. On the south, another called Licking Fork. On the west is another called Raccoon. And on the north, one named Log Pond Run. Time will not permit me to make any more buildings. Therefore, your imagination must interpret buildings. And that's where the letter ends. So she said, I put a couple buildings on there, but I don't have time to draw any more. Unfortunately, she didn't sign it, or if she did, that part of the letter is not, doesn't exist with this, or is lost or something. But this is a really interesting thing because she's come to a new place. She speaks very highly of Newark and gives a really interesting description. This is a view of Newark from what would have been the 1840s. And this was drawn by Henry Howe, who was an author. He wrote sort of the first, essentially, Bible on Ohio history. And he went county by county and talked about the towns and the history of each county. And he did a lot of drawings which were become etchings for the book. So as you can see, this is a view of the square. Unfortunately, we don't know, I don't know which direction it's coming from, but trying to base it on some of the buildings, I believe it's from the perspective of South Park looking north. We do know that this courthouse that's pictured was oriented east-west, so the columns were on both the east side and the west side. But I think based on this building, we can recognize, it doesn't look like that now, but I think we can recognize that where this building is. So I believe that these buildings up here are North Park, and we're looking from the perspective of South Park Place. And now that could be completely off because I don't know for sure. That's just my assumption. But this gives you a good picture and a good look at the former courthouse. So this was the courthouse that was the predecessor to our current one. And believe it or not, this was actually the third courthouse that was on that spot. If you can think back to that hand-drawn map, it pointed out log courthouse in the center. And that was the very first one. So that was built fairly late, actually, after Newark's establishment. So if you think, Newark was part of Fairfield County when it was originally formed in 1802, which at the time was part of the Northwest Territory. Ohio hadn't even become a state yet. However, in 1808, Licking County was formed out of the portion of Fairfield County. There was a little bit of competition between who would become the county seat between Newark and Hebron. But Newark went out and became the county seat, so they needed a courthouse. So the very first courthouse was built in 1809, which was built out of log, and it was in about the same spot that the courthouse is now. As you can imagine, it was not very large, just a small log cabin type structure. And it was only around for about 6 years. Around 1815, the second courthouse was built, and it was built slightly north of the original one. And that one was 2 stories, and I believe it had 4 rooms in it. I think a room on each end of the 2 stories, making a total of 4. And that one was around for a little bit longer. But during this period of time, Newark and Licking County started to see a lot of growth. And a lot of that had to do with the construction of the Ohio and Erie Canal. On July 4th of 1825, ground was broken just 4 miles from downtown Newark, actually what's in now Heath along 79. They broke ground for the canal, and that brought a lot of commerce to and through Newark. Of course, the canal ran right through Newark. It went through downtown, just south of the square. And it was incredibly important because it made Newark really well situated for industry and manufacturing and just business and commerce in general. So that really led to an increase in Newark's size and population. So that original small 4-room courthouse was quickly outgrown. And in 1832, they built the one that we're looking at. This is another picture of it from one of the ends. I like this. This is later on in its lifetime, probably 1860s or early 1870s. But this courthouse was built in 1832, and it was a Greek Revival style. I'll go back to the other picture just so you can get a good look of it again. It had columns on either end that were built out of locally quarried sandstone. And it was pretty big. It was actually, that was a point of contention with some people in the community because they felt that it was too expensive and it was too big. They thought that the Greek Revival overhang and pediment on top of the columns was too extravagant and was a waste of taxpayer money. So some people were pretty upset about it. But it served the needs, and it was an indication of how Newark was growing in that time. Also, that time period, we see a lot of popularity of Greek Revival architecture. So that's interesting to me as well, because some of the older houses that we still have in town are Greek Revival from the 1830s. So it's another indication of the time period, which I find interesting. This courthouse wasn't really around for that long, though, unfortunately, because as I said, it was built in 1832, and it burnt down actually in 1875 or 1875. I had to go back. It was on that slide. So it caught fire, and basically the entire thing was destroyed. I have seen pictures of the rubble, and essentially only those columns were standing that were such a point of contention. It was totally destroyed. So then they built the new courthouse, which is the one that we still have, which is still around. And it also did catch fire, but was luckily not completely destroyed, and they were able to repair it. As you can see, though, the courthouse was sort of the center of a public park, and they really tried to make it a place that people would want to come. And when this courthouse was built, that was really when they made the resolution that no other buildings would stand on the square. They wanted it to feature just the courthouse, but they really wanted the grounds around the courthouse to serve as a place for the public to come, sort of a park in essence. This is also a later picture. This is from the 1860s, but it gives you an idea of some of the feeling of Newark before a lot of the brick buildings that we have now were built, which were largely in the 1860s and 1870s. This is South Park Place. This is the corner of South Park and 3rd. So this right here is the corner. And these are the buildings that were, according to legend, burned down, whether on accident or by purpose, by Adam Kiesel, who is labeled Newark's first firebug. And if you're not familiar with the story, it goes that he owned a business in this area and bought insurance for it, and then it burnt down somewhat mysteriously. He was charged for arson, but the residents of Newark thought that he had done them a service because a lot of the buildings were wooden and they were sort of in disrepair. So they thought that he had actually improved the city by getting rid of them, and was supposedly acquitted and honored with an engraving of his face above the door on First National Bank, which was built on the corner here where this building is, which is still there. And that was built in 1870. So we know that that story, if it actually happened, took place before 1870, sometime in the 1860s. But I wanted to include this picture because it gives you an idea of what Newark in those years would have been like. A lot of the first buildings that were put around the square were built out of wood. There were some early brick buildings, but not as many, and a lot of them were wood. In fact, into the 20th century, we still had some of those very old wood buildings, and this was the last remaining wood block in Newark. So this was located on West Church Street. This is directly across from what's now 31 West. It's just a parking lot now. This building actually here along the side is still standing. And then this is the Masonic building on the corner of West Church and 4th. So just to give you some perspective of where it was. So this is representative of what a lot of the buildings in earlier Newark would have looked like. And by early Newark, I mean pre-1850. This one was not quite that old. It was built in the 1850s and then eventually burnt down in the 1950s. It was a grocery store at the time that it burnt down. But it gives you an idea of what this would have looked like. It's, you know, I don't want to give the impression that Newark looked like a stereotypical frontier town. It definitely at one time was log cabins and that kind of thing. But we've grown up with memories of Walnut Grove and Little House on the Prairie, and it's not always quite accurate. It wasn't as just kind of roughly put together as sometimes we think. And you can really get a sense of that from this picture. It looks, you know, for all intents and purposes, a pretty standard building. It's just made out of wood, whereas a lot of ours are brick now downtown. We can't talk about early Newark without talking about some of our early buildings that are still around. And this is probably the oldest building in the downtown area that you can still see. There is one other home in Newark that's thought to be older than this, but this is likely our second oldest building in Newark. This is the Sherwood Davidson house. This is a picture of it in its original location, which was on West Church Street and 3rd Street, where Park National Bank is now. This home it's a little unsure when exactly it was built. There's a range as early as 1815 to as late as 1828. So sometime in there. Unfortunately, it's not known exactly when it was built. It's an example of federal style architecture, which is common for that time period. And it's just a really cool house. If you've not been to it, I would definitely suggest that you go because it's pretty neat. But this was one of Newark's nicer homes, definitely larger, more prominent home. But it gives you an idea of what you might see around Newark at the time. And of course, it still exists. So as I said, if you've not been there, you need to visit. This is it in Veterans Park. It was moved in the 1940s from its original location to where it is now on 6th Street in the park. This is another of downtown Newark's old buildings. And this one, of course, is still there. This is on the corner of South Park and 2nd. For a long time, it was the Conrad drugstore, which a lot of people remember it as. As you can see in this caption on the bottom, it says it was built 1828 to 1829. I think that's got to be an estimate because I've seen other things that place it in either late 1820s or early 1830s. It's very difficult to often determine when exactly a building was built unless someone, for whatever reason, happened to write it down in the time, which usually didn't happen. But it is the oldest building that's on the square pretty easily, I would say. And of course, we can still see it. So it was most recently the popcorn shop on the corner. As you can tell, it looks visibly older than, well, definitely older than the one next to it. But you can tell by some of the details, it's just a little bit older than some of the other buildings that we have around the square. As I said, a lot of our buildings that we still see date from around the 1860s to the 1870s in downtown Newark, that is. There is another one, actually, go to this one. This is St. Paul's Church. Originally, it was built as Trinity Episcopal Church. And this is another one of the older buildings downtown. This was built in 1834, slightly younger than the building we just looked at. You might not recognize this though, but it does still exist. It's on 1st Street. And in fact, it's right across from the Works. If you've actually been to the Works to visit us, I'm assuming most of you have, or at least know where we are. This building is directly across from us. it just looks a little bit different now. This is how it looks today. And you can see the church rising up from the center, but it was enclosed in this building that was originally a car dealership and a muffler shop. And now it's owned by Park National Bank and they have offices in there. But the church actually comes up out of the middle of the building. It's built, the building surrounds it. If I go back, you can see part of the steeple has been taken off. So it's cut off right around here. But you can see it coming out. So that one's unfortunate because it's most people drive past it and probably don't ever recognize that there's even a building sticking up above what they see, nor do they realize that it's one of the oldest buildings in downtown Newark. And, you know, especially important because it's still in its original location. So it's pretty cool for people like me. And then this is another one that's on the square that's much older. And I think, so I mentioned based on that drawing by Henry Howe, why I thought that we were looking toward North Park Place. This is the American House. It was a hotel for quite a long time. Built in around 1840 or so. Again, it's difficult to know exactly, but sometime in the 1840s, most likely, this was built. But it's got that profile on the ends, which is recognizable in the drawing. So that's what makes me think that that could be what we're looking at, although I don't have any actual justification other than that. But this building today is still around. It's the Buckeye Winery. So that's on 3rd Street, sort of at the very end of North Park Place. Just another building where you can kind of get a sense of what type of architecture would have been around. It's been updated and changed a little bit. It's been added some Italianate details and things that were excuse me, more common in the 1870s when a lot of the buildings were built. So it has been changed a little bit, but that's another one of our older buildings downtown. And we can't talk about Old Newark without talking about this guy. So I had mentioned the book that we use for a lot of the information about early Newark was written by unnamed author, but later come to find out was Wellington Stanbury. This is William Stanbury, who was Wellington's father. This man, you can kind of just tell by looking at him, he looks like a character, and he definitely was. He was an attorney, so he was admitted to the bar and then came to Newark in 1809. And his family were really one of the very first kind of prominent families in Newark. They were very well known. He was obviously affluent just based on his profession. Later, he joined Congress. He was a member of the House of Representatives. He was, prominent before that too. He was appointed the Secretary of Northwest Territorial Legislative Council from 1799 to 1802. He was involved in the Constitutional Convention for the state of Ohio. He was just a pretty important guy. Like I said, he was an attorney though, so he came to Newark and practiced here, eventually joining the House of Representatives. And one of the things that actually happened that he's most well known for, and if you talk about him to somebody who's not from Newark, but is an American historian, they will be likely familiar with him because he famously got into a duel with Sam Houston, who Houston, Texas is named after. In April of 1832, he had made some accusations about Sam Houston, who was in Washington, D.C. at the time. He actually made them on the floor of the House. So he was very publicly saying some negative things about Sam Houston. He was using Houston as sort of a scapegoat to really attack President Andrew Jackson. But he was, making these claims about Houston. So eventually, Sam Houston meets up with him outside on Pennsylvania Avenue and beats William Stanbury with a hickory cane. So Stanbury actually pulled out a gun and put it to Houston's chest and pulled the trigger. However, it misfired, so he didn't shoot Sam Houston. although he tried. However, Sam Houston was the one who was arrested for, I guess, instigating the fight. And he hired Francis Scott Key as his attorney, who was the man who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. He said it was self-defense, but he ended up being found guilty. But he really didn't get any sort of reprimand for it. So Stanberry then filed civil charges, and Houston was actually found liable, and he was fined $500. However, Houston escaped to Texas, which was not then yet part of the United States. And that's where he stayed. So he never paid the fine. Nothing was ever resolved. But that was really famous, a famous thing that happened. And it sort of gives you insight as to how things are maybe as sometimes we like to talk about politics and how people get into arguments, but I think we're a little bit more civil now than actually things used to be. Nobody's physically fighting each other. But it just gives you some sort of insight. All that to say, this guy really was a character. So he came back to Newark after his time in Congress and continued to practice as an attorney. He built one of the best known party houses essentially in Newark, which was just about a couple miles northeast of Newark, where Camp O'Bannon is now. So he was just a very, very well-known figure in and around Newark. Luckily, though, his son, Wellington, wrote down a lot of his memories and the things that he experienced in Newark, and we have that now preserved. So I will say the book that a lot of that information comes from, it's called A Pen Picture of Newark and Vicinity as it appeared in 1818. That is available through the library, actually. It's the Licking County Library's website. They have a digitized PDF of it available. So it's not very long, actually. I think it's about 40 pages. So it's a really quick, easy read, but it's very interesting and it gives a lot of insight about early Newark. There's a lot of interesting events that happened from sort of a festival that they called the General Muster, where they would do different types of things on the square, to personal stories about individual people, stories about stores, different types of businesses. It's really, really interesting. So I would recommend you go to their website. It's just lickingcountylibrary.org. They have a local history section on their website, which has the PDF of that book on there. So it's definitely interesting. There's a lot of firsthand accounts on there that you can read. So that wraps it up for my presentation. This is a little bit of a different one than what I typically do, because obviously when we're talking about 200 years ago, we don't really have a lot of photos or things to share. But I wanted to kind of talk about what we can at least gain from some of the writings that we have about early Newark. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If you have questions about specific things, if there's something that maybe I touched on but you want to know more about, or that I didn't cover at all that you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to me. You can also type a chat on here if you would like, and I would be happy to answer that as well if you have a question. But otherwise, feel free to send me an email. My email address is on the screen, Cory Stutes @theworks.org. And I'll get back with you on any sort of details that I can find. Sometimes people have research requests or just questions, but you can also give me a call. My phone number is also on the screen, so feel free to do it that way. And I will turn my camera back on just so that you guys can see me. Again, I just want to say thank you. Matt, thanks for your comment. I really appreciate that. I am really happy to be able to do these presentations from home. We have been doing works at home experiences really since spring. So your participation in these things is what helps us keep going. We are doing History at Home series for the next few months. The next one will be in December, but keep an eye out on our Facebook, on our website, because we'll be listing the dates for that. As always, you'll want to register for these presentations in advance so that you can get a link to join. We do still have our mini kits and our works at home full-size kits as well. So if you're interested in doing programming, if you have children or grandchildren or anything like that you have at home and you'd like to do that, you can check out our website check out our Facebook or give us a call to get information on that as well. So once again, thank you everyone for joining. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer it as best as I can. If not, hopefully I will see you all next month, the next History at Home. Thanks a lot.